Well, it is 5:32, so I will kick things off. Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Nicole Moen, and I am the president of the board of the Harvard Club of Minnesota. I am so happy that all of you could join us here virtually tonight. The Harvard Club of Minnesota strives to provide opportunities for Harvard alumni to connect with each other, participate in community activities, and engage in current events. Although our events range from the lighthearted to the serious, I'd like to think that we all agree in our commitment to be educated global citizens. Our shared values include a recognition of the importance of pursuing truth. Veritas. Now, typically at this time of year, we would be having our annual club banquet, but given the circumstances, this year our gathering remains on Zoom. Although personally very much looking forward to future club events happening in person, one big advantage of Zoom is accessibility. People from all over are attending this event tonight, and no wonder, given our speaker, Professor Michael Klarman. Before we get to Professor Klarman's talk, I'd like to go over some club business briefly, and then I will introduce him. For those of you who have recently joined or renewed your membership in the Harvard Club of Minnesota, thank you. Our club depends on your support. For those of you who have not yet joined or renewed, here's a friendly reminder that if you join or renew now, your membership will run through June of 2022. So a little over a year if you join now. For those of you who are joining us from other states, and I'll take the prerogative to speak on behalf of all Harvard clubs, I'd like to say thank you to those of you who are members of your clubs. And for those of you who are not, to strongly consider joining. The Harvard Club of Minnesota's next event is the Alumni Network for Harvard Women on May 18th. Other events are in the works, so please watch your emails and check the club website for updates. We look forward to holding in-person events very soon. We are also always looking for ideas for new events. If you have an idea for an event, please feel free to contact the club. Similarly, if you are interested in volunteering for the club or looking to get more involved in the club, we would love to hear from you. The contact information is on the club's website. And now, please allow me to introduce our esteemed guest, Professor Michael J. Klarman. Professor Klarman is the Kirkland Ellis Professor at Harvard Law School, where he joined the faculty in 2008. He received his BA and MA in political theory from the University of Pennsylvania, his JD from Stanford Law School, and his Doctor of Philosophy and Legal History from the University of Oxford, where he was a Marshall Scholar. After law school, Professor Klarman clerked for the Honorable Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the United States Court of Appeals for the DC Circuit. He later joined the faculty at the University of Virginia School of Law and served there until 2008, when he joined the faculty at Harvard Law School. Professor Clarman has won numerous awards for his teaching and scholarship, which are primarily in the areas of constitutional law and constitutional history. In 2009, he was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Professor Clarman has published a number of books, including From Jim Crow to Civil Rights, the Supreme Court and the Struggle for Racial Equality, Brown v. Board of Education and the Civil Rights Movement and Unfinished Business, Racial Equality in American History, From the Closet to the Altar, Courts, Backlash and the Struggle for Same-Sex Marriage, and more recently, The Framers' Coup, The Making of the United States Constitution. Tonight, Professor Klarman will speak on the degradation of American democracy, the court's contributions to that degradation, and possible remedial steps that might be taken. His talk is based on his recent Harvard Law Review article, The Degradation of American Democracy and the Court, which was published in November of last year. A link to the article is available on the Harvard Club of Minnesota website. After Professor Klarman concludes his talk, we'll save some time for questions. I'd like to ask everyone to use the chat feature to ask your questions. So please type your question into the chat, and then I'll read the questions during the Q&A portion. I'd like to ask everyone to post only questions in the chat as opposed to remarks or comments to other people or other discussion, because that will make it easier for me to find and read the questions. And with that, I will turn it over to Professor Clarman. Please join me in welcoming Professor Klarman.
Thanks very much, Nicole, for the kind introduction, and thanks to Jim for organizing the event. My topic, as Nicole explained, is the degradation of American democracy, the Supreme Court's contributions to that degradation, and possible remedial steps that might be taken. My talk lasts for about 35 to 40 minutes, and then, as Nicole said, happy to take questions. Now, I need to say one thing before I actually begin with the substance of the talk. While my goal is never to offend anyone by what I say, I fear that some of you may be offended by some of what I say this evening, and indeed may think that I'm some sort of extreme partisan. While I don't think that charge is fair, I believe I always speak factually, tell the truth as I see it, and hold no particular brief for the Democratic Party. I recognize that some of you may not like what I'm about to say, and I want you to know that I don't disrespect you simply because we disagree politically. And I certainly invite you to ask a question, and if you believe I've gone wrong, to explain to me how. The recent degradation of democracy has been a worldwide phenomenon. Countries such as Poland, Hungary, Turkey, the Philippines, and Brazil have all experienced substantial deteriorations in their democracies over the last 15 years or so. There's a kind of authoritarian playbook that is developed. Autocrats alter political structures to their advantage, and they attack the neutral arbiters of the system, such as judges, media, and civil servants. Autocrats are especially intent to take over intelligence agencies and prosecutorial offices that offer a sword to be used against adversaries and a shield with which to protect friends. They lie, they encourage political violence, and they attack the other, often Muslims and immigrants, to consolidate their support and distract attention from their failure to solve actual problems. Over the past 15 years or so, American democracy itself has been under siege, both from President Trump and probably more importantly from the Republican Party. To start with Trump, the president displayed an openly authoritarian bent. He attacked the press as the enemy of the people, assailed judicial independence, politicized the Justice Department and the intelligence agencies, encouraged political violence, undermined fundamental norms of government transparency, delegitimized elections and called his political opponents traitors, and manifested a bizarre admiration for foreign autocrats. Just in the last couple of months before the 2020 election, Trump refused to commit to a peaceful transition of power, refused to condemn white supremacists, sowed groundless doubts about the reliability of voting by mail, and insisted that the only way he could lose the election was through fraud. And of course, after the election, he endlessly propagated the big lie that the election was stolen from him, solicited election fraud from the Georgia Secretary of State by demanding that he find enough votes to make Trump the victor, summoned Republican legislative leaders from Michigan to the White House to try to dragoon them into allocating the state's electoral votes to him, even though he lost the state by about 150,000 votes. And on January 6th, of course, he incited a coup against the Capitol. Essentially, all of the behavior just described comes straight out of the authoritarian playbook, yet the vast majority of Republican elected officials lack the courage and the decency to voice any significant criticisms. In addition, the Republican Party itself over the last 15 years has assailed democracy through a wide variety of state electoral practices. Republican-controlled state governments have suppressed votes through restrictive voter identification laws and purges of the voter rolls. They have grotesquely gerrymandered legislative districts, enabling Republicans to maintain control of state legislatures and the House of Representatives while failing to win majorities of the vote. Republicans have also erected obstacles to college students voting, delayed elections that they anticipated they might lose, eviscerated the powers of Democratic governors, rejected the results of voter initiatives of which they disapproved, and imposed new obstacles to putting such initiatives on the ballot in the first place, and come to the verge of criminalizing mass voter registration drives. In the months prior to the 2020 election, Republican elected officials across the nation made it harder to vote during a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic. refusing in some states to expand excuse-based absentee balloting, restricting the availability of drop boxes to collect absentee ballots, refusing to relax witness signature requirements for absentee ballots, and declining to allow the counting of absentee ballots postmarked but not received by Election Day. Every Republican-controlled legislature in the country today is taking up legislation to make it harder to vote. For example, the law recently enacted in Georgia makes it harder to obtain and cast mail ballots, radically limits the number of drop boxes in the large population counties around Atlanta, expands the ability of poll watchers to object to voters and more difficult to remove them from the polling place if they engage in obstreperous behavior, bans counties from establishing mobile polling places, virtually eliminates the use of provisional ballots for voters who turn up at the wrong precinct, criminalizes offering food or water to persons standing in line to vote, allows the legislature to replace county voting officials pretty much at will, and gives the Republican legislature greater control over the state election board, essentially paving the way to their simply stealing the next presidential election if Republicans don't like the outcome. Two factors mainly explain this relatively recent Republican assault on democracy at the state level. The Republican Party did not engage in this sort of behavior in the 1990s. First, the national electorate today is more evenly divided than it was for much of the last century. Suppressing a few thousand votes here and there can affect the outcome of elections with enormous political consequences. Second, dramatic demographic changes together with increased secularization and growing social liberalism have led Republicans to conclude that their political agenda no longer commands majority support. Recognizing that their party performs better when voter turnout decreases, Republicans have chosen to shrink the electorate rather than alter their party's agenda to make it more popular. As already briefly noted, the Republican Party has been complicit with Trump. Congressional Republicans did not want the 2016 Trump campaign's involvement with Russia investigated by special counsel Mueller. They were untroubled by Trump's systematic obstruction of that investigation. They voted against his impeachment and removal from office over his shakedown phone call to the president of Ukraine, requesting that requesting that Zelensky dig up dirt on Trump's political opponent. And they did not mind his systematic obstruction of congressional oversight. After Trump's Senate acquittal, Republicans acquiesced to his takeover of the intelligence establishment, his war against whistleblowers and inspectors general, his politicization of the Justice Department, and his catastrophic response to the coronavirus pandemic. They did not seem to mind the campaign finance violations that possibly won Trump the presidency in 2016, his arguable daily violations of the Foreign Emoluments Clause, or his strange ardor for President Putin and Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Almost the entirety of the party has been a profile in cowardice over the last 4 years. Let me say a few words about why this degradation of American democracy is happening now. There's several distinct factors at work. Political scientists largely agree that racial resentment is the most important factor leading Republican voters and the party generally to lose enthusiasm for democracy. The United States population was 90% white in the 1950s. It was still 80% white in 1980, but today it's less than 60% white, and demographers project that the country will no longer be majority white by the early 2040s. In the 1950s, 93% of the people who voted for the Democratic Party were white. Today, that figure is probably down to 50% or very close to it. Such developments are profoundly unsettling to many Americans, although I'm sure not to most of you, making them ripe pickings for a racist demagogue such as Trump. In the 1980s, the Democratic and Republican parties contained roughly equal percentages of whites who registered high levels of racial resentment. But over the last 30 years, such resentment has become increasingly concentrated within the GOP. And in the 2016 Republican primaries, racial resentment was highly correlated with support for Donald Trump. These are the people who believe that white Americans suffer more discrimination today than Black Americans, who still don't believe that Barack Obama was born in the United States, who want to build a wall on the Mexican border and keep Muslims entirely out of the country, and love it when Trump promises to send Black and brown congresswomen back to the shithole nations from which they came, even though mostly they came from the United States. Religious change has been another important factor in the degradation of American democracy. Over the last half century, the United States has experienced the collapse of the idea of America as a Christian nation. Religious conservatives, distraught by this development, became concentrated in the Republican Party, beginning with the culture war issues of the 1960s and 1970s, and then with the mobilization of white evangelical Christians in politics through the moral majority beginning towards the end of the 1970s. There's been a dawning realization over the last 30 years or so, roughly beginning around 1990, a dawning realization by religious conservatives that they are destined to lose the culture wars, the normalization of homosexuality, changing gender norms, making genuine equality for women increasingly a reality in American society, and the constitutionalization most recently of gay marriage. Religious conservatives in recent decades have seen their children, and especially their grandchildren, leaving their churches, turned off especially by the homophobia of those churches, and also their resistance to various racial reforms, such as those demanded by Black Lives Matter. Roughly 67% of Americans aged 65 and above today are white Christians, but only 29% of Americans aged 18 to 29. I'm going to repeat that because it's so striking, and I think it's a statistic that most people are pretty unaware of. Roughly 67%, that is 2/3 of Americans aged 65 and above, are white Christians, but only 29%, less than a third, of Americans aged 18 to 29. Americans claiming no religious affiliation at all have more than tripled from 7% in 1974 to 22% in 2014, and that's certainly ticked up by a couple percentage points in the last 7 years. Today, when asked about their religious affiliation, the largest block of Democratic Party voters identifies as none of the above. By 2024, white Christians may, for the first time in American history, not be a majority of the electorate. This is a profoundly disorienting development for many of those who think of the United States as a white Christian nation, which it has been unofficially for nearly the entirety of its history. Neo-Ayn Randism is the third explanation for the degradation of American democracy. Radical libertarians who were politically marginalized during the Great Depression and World War II, and indeed in the decades after World War II, who began reasserting themselves, especially beginning in the 1970s. Libertarian billionaires such as the Koch brothers, Richard Scaife and John Olin, began investing in libertarian think tanks such as Heritage and Cato, asserting themselves on college campuses through the Olin Fund and in law schools through the Federalist Society, and gaining political ascendancy with Ronald Reagan, who taught us that government is always the problem, never the solution. Radical tax reformers such as Grover Norquist came to dominate the Republican Party in the 1980s, and the radical libertarians even exerted considerable influence in the administrations of Democratic Presidents Clinton and Obama. This has culminated today in a Republican Party that denies human-caused climate change, pursues tax cuts that overwhelmingly benefit corporations and the wealthiest Americans, undermines labor unions at every turn, and aims to eviscerate the social safety net. Good illustrations of this libertarian extremism are former Speaker of the House Paul Ryan's declaration that free school lunches for poor children feed the stomach and corrupt the soul, and the governor of North Dakota, which at one point last fall had the highest per capita COVID-19 rate of any jurisdiction in the entire world, declaring that the pandemic is not a problem for government to solve. One wonders what exactly do these people think the point of government is if it's not to orchestrate a scientifically informed and coordinated response to disasters like the coronavirus pandemic. This sort of radical libertarian has always seen democracy as a problem because insufficiently protective of property rights. The fourth factor in the degradation of American democracy is a dramatic rise in economic inequality over the last 40 years, a development that's obviously related to the preceding point. The American working class had seen its wages double between 1935 and 1960, and then double again over the next generation. During those years, blue-collar workers without college degrees, partly thanks to their strong labor unions, could buy homes and send their children to college on a single income, and their offspring were likely to fare even better economically. But since 1980, essentially all of the gains from economic growth have gone to the top 10% of earners, and most of that indeed to the top 1%. American workers now have lower life expectancies than those in comparable Western democracies. Their babies have higher infant mortality rates, and they have much worse access to health care than workers in comparable countries, although the nation's GDP, about twice as much of it is allocated to health care in the United States than in these other countries. Life expectancies in some age ranges of the white working class are declining through deaths of despair, suicides, and deaths from drug overdoses and alcoholism. Worsening economic inequality and deteriorating social and economic conditions created an opportunity for a racist demagogue such as Trump to appeal to white economically dispossessed workers. While those people should have been blaming globalization, technological change, and neo-Ayn Randian government policies for their ills, Trump and the Republican Party have sought instead to convince them to blame Mexicans, Muslims, and Satan-worshiping child molesters in the Democratic Party. Fifth and finally, several features of our political system, such as partisan primaries, winner-take-all districted elections, and virtually unlimited money in politics, feed political polarization and negative partisanship. Technological changes in media and the changing media consumption patterns they have produced, the so-called Fox News effect, further exacerbate polarization and negative partisanship. Such forces pave the way for an autocratic demagogue to take over one of our major political parties, something that would not have been conceivable for most of American history. In addition, various political structures such as geographic clustering, partisan gerrymandering, malapportionment of the United States Senate, and the malapportionment, together with the vagaries of the Electoral College, have made minoritarian government not only possible, but actually quite probable. Those features of our system, in combination with pervasive voter suppression, enable a political party with a distinctly unpopular policy platform to retain a fighting chance for control of the national government. Republican Supreme Court justices have been largely complicit with this assault on democracy. In 2013, they effectively nullified the preclearance provision of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which required mostly Southern states to submit proposed changes to their voting practices to the federal government for advance approval in order to ensure the absence of a discriminatory racial purpose or a disparate racial impact on minority voters. Republican justices have also upheld strict voter identification laws and purges of the voter rolls on the basis of the state's supposed interest in reducing voter fraud, which numerous studies have demonstrated is a virtually non-existent problem. In 2019, the Republican justices refused to remedy the problem of partisan gerrymandering, which today mostly benefits Republicans. They've also unleashed a virtually unrestricted flow of money into politics on the basis of contrived constitutional rationales, which disproportionately benefits wealthy donors, corporations, and well-funded interest groups. Rather than defending democracy, the court under Republican control has become another engine of democratic degradation, which leads me to my final topic, which is court reform. Democrats have not controlled the Supreme Court since 1969. Their first real chance to do so in the last 50 years came in February 2016, when Justice Scalia died suddenly during Obama's presidency. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell blocked that Democratic opportunity by essentially stealing a Supreme Court seat for the first time in American history. Now, McConnell insisted that historical precedent supported leaving Supreme Court vacancies unfulfilled during presidential election years, but this was a lie and was rated as such by PolitiFact. Never before had a Senate controlled by one party blocked a Supreme Court nominee offered by the president of another party simply because the vacancy occurred during a presidential election year. In 2020, McConnell confirmed his hypocrisy by ensuring that the Senate confirmed the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett just 8 days before the election. Democrats suffer today from several structural features of the American political system that permit minority rule. At the state legislative and congressional levels, Democrats are disadvantaged by a combination of partisan gerrymandering and geographic clustering that together often disable Democrats from converting a majority of votes into a majority of legislative seats. For example, although Democrats in Pennsylvania and Ohio frequently win statewide elections, they've been unable to control either state Senate for nearly the last 4 decades because Democratic voters are inefficiently concentrated in and around large cities. For the same reasons, after recent decennial redistrictings, Republicans have won 13 out of 18 Pennsylvania congressional seats, despite winning only about half of the state's congressional vote. On average, these factors have cost Democrats a couple of dozen congressional seats in recent elections. Democrats are even more disadvantaged in the competition for control of the US Senate. Because of a provision in the Constitution that cannot be amended without the consent of every state, Wyoming, which has just over 600,000 residents, and California, which has nearly 40 million, are each allocated 2 senators. Equal state representation in the Senate, which was quite difficult to justify in 1787, is impossible to reconcile today with the principle of one person, one vote. Because of today's partisan geography, which features a stark divide between the political preferences of urban and rural voters, the Republican Party benefits greatly from the Senate's malapportionment. For example, in today's evenly divided Senate, the 50 Democrats represent over 40 million more voters than the 50 Republicans. This is an outrage to the principle of one person, one vote and political equality. Lastly, the Electoral College, in combination with another feature of today's partisan geography, which is the relatively high concentration of white working class voters in several states that happen to be narrowly divided between the 2 main political parties, mostly Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, that significantly advantages Republican presidential candidates. Although Democrats have now won the popular vote in 7 of the last presidential elections, they have won the Electoral College only 5 times. Donald Trump lost the 2020 popular vote by 4.5 percentage points, which means over 7 million votes. But if you switched fewer than 43,000 votes in 3 key states, he would have been reelected president. These Democratic deficits in the Senate and the Electoral College have enabled Republicans to dominate the Supreme Court despite winning the support of a diminishing minority of voters. Presidents George W. Bush and Donald Trump, neither of whom initially entered the White House with even a plurality of the popular vote, have appointed 5 of today's 6 Republican justices. 4 of those justices were confirmed by narrow majorities of Republican senators who did not represent a majority of the American people. If the Senate and the Electoral College were more reflective of majority will, today's Supreme Court could not possibly have become the most conservative in the last 100 years, as confirmed by multiple academic studies. Instead, today's Republican justices aggressively advance the agenda of the Republican Party. In addition to upholding voter suppression, they have undermined labor unions, unleashed money in politics, protected corporations from class action litigation and punitive damage awards, curbed antitrust laws, eroded the constitutional right to abortion, invalidated gun control measures, struck down voluntary efforts by school boards to achieve integration through race-conscious means, and threatened to invalidate race-based affirmative action. Directly remedying the democratic deficits of the Electoral College and the Senate is virtually impossible, though they can be ameliorated by creating new states. Constitutional amendments would be required to alter these institutions, and amendments are practically unobtainable when one of the 2 major political parties benefits from the status quo. However, the size of the Supreme Court can be changed by statute. Congress altered the court size 6 times in the 19th century, though not since 1869, and for reasons that included raw partisanship. At the first opportunity, I would argue Democrats should expand the court to provide a center-left country with a center-left court that will not threaten the constitutionality of democratic measures to expand access to health care, deal with gun violence, address climate change, and more fairly distribute the tax burden. Now, the principal argument against Democrats expanding the court is that Republicans will simply respond in kind the next time they have the opportunity to do so, inciting a never-ending retaliatory spiral. However, I believe there are 3 powerful responses to this argument. First, Republicans initiated this arms race by stealing the court vacancy that was rightfully President Obama's to fill in 2016. For Democrats to refrain from responding in kind to Senator McConnell's shrinking of the court for 1 year is to unilaterally disarm. As game theorists have taught us, the quickest way to restore a stable equilibrium after one party in a reiterative game has repudiated a norm of cooperation is to retaliate in kind. Failing to do so only incentivizes more of the norm-breaking behavior. Second, Republicans themselves will almost surely enlarge the size of the court the first time they have the opportunity and see the need to do so. Suppose that Democrats refrain from expanding the court now, despite having an opportunity to do so. Next, imagine that 2 Republican justices are tragically killed in an automobile accident, and President Biden and the Democratic Senate replace them with 2 Democratic justices, thus restoring Democrats to the 5-4 majority they ought to have enjoyed after Justice Scalia's death. Now suppose that in 2024, a Republican is elected president and Republicans win control of Congress. Does anyone who has followed American politics for the last 15 years doubt that Senate Majority Leader McConnell would at that point pursue court expansion? His argument for doing so would be precisely the same as his argument in October for confirming Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court. Republicans had the power to do so, and nothing in the Constitution prohibited them from doing so. He might add a claim that Democrats would have done the same thing if they were in his position, so he would have to be a fool not to do so. After all, Democrats had talked about expanding the size of the court in 2021. Expanding the court is a form of political hardball, defined as defying norms and traditions without violating the letter of the law. This is something Republicans have excelled at playing over the last decade or so. In addition to blocking the Garland nomination, McConnell prevented President Obama from filling dozens of Court of Appeals vacancies during Obama's last 2 years in office. McConnell used the filibuster nearly as much in his 6 years as minority leader as it had been used in the previous 100 years. He disabled some federal agencies from functioning at all by refusing to confirm Obama's nominees to head them. And he ensured in 2009 that the stimulus package in response to the Great Recession secured almost no Republican support in the Senate, which would be roughly the equivalent to Democrats having blocked a coronavirus relief package in the spring of 2020 in order to hinder Trump's reelection prospects, a step I would remind you that not a single Democrat publicly advocated. In addition, at the state level, Republicans have already recently packed the Supreme Courts of Arizona and Georgia, attempted to do so in North Carolina, and threatened to do so in Florida. To reiterate, it cannot be a persuasive argument against Democrats expanding the court that Republicans will simply retaliate in kind one day. Republicans have amply demonstrated they will break the norm against court expansion, as well as many other norms, regardless of what Democrats do now. The third response to the retaliatory cycle concern is that Democratic expansion of the court to ensure that Republican justices do not invalidate democracy entrenching legislation could produce a new political epoch. In this altered political environment, the current unpopularity of the Republican Party's agenda, consisting mostly of appeals to racial and religious resentment and xenophobia, combined with neo-Ayn Randian economic policies, such as tax cuts overwhelmingly benefiting the wealthy, economic deregulation, and environmental degradation, will cause the party to consistently lose elections. That has not happened to date because of the democratic deficits in American political institutions and widespread Republican voter suppression and other electoral machinations such as extreme gerrymandering. A series of electoral defeats might lead the Republican Party to enact a platform more appealing to today's median voter, abandon practices of voter suppression. Sorry, my phone is occasionally interfering with this, and perhaps even an acknowledgement of its error in stealing a court seat in 2016. Such a scenario may seem Panglossian, but the United States has historically experienced tectonic shifts in politics, most notably beginning in 1896, in 1932, and in 1968. Shifts that led to one party's political dominance and the other party's eventually reforming itself in order to expand its voter appeal. However, creating a new political epoch requires the entrenchment of democracy. One of the first democratic reform measures this year includes protecting and expanding access to the ballot. Voter registration should be automatic when citizens turn 18 and easy for older citizens. Same-day registration enhances turnout without increasing fraud, as Republicans baselessly charge. Felon disfranchisement, which has enormous racially disparate effects and often was instituted long ago with a racially discriminatory purpose, should be ended. Election day should be made a national holiday. The number of early voting days, polling places, and voting machines should be increased to end the national disgrace of working class African Americans in Atlanta having to wait in lines for as long as 5 to 10 hours to vote. Absentee ballots should be available without excuse. Onerous identification requirements for voting should be eliminated because they reduce turnout on the pretext of reducing fraud. Partisan gerrymandering has no plausible justification and should be ended. Yet a Republican-controlled court could easily invalidate such democracy entrenching legislation, at least insofar as it applied to state and presidential elections on the basis of contrived federalism rationales already developed and implemented by Republican justices. Those same justices could conceivably invalidate most of the reform measures contemplated by the Biden administration that I noted earlier, such as expanding medical care. Court reform is a prerequisite to entrenching democracy, ameliorating economic inequality, protecting the environment, and accomplishing various forms of progressive social change. Whether Democrats now in control of the national government have the sense and the guts to pursue it is a very different question. Thank you for your patience. And of course, I'm happy to take questions now.
All right, thank you, Professor Klarman. All right, so I have this is a question to me privately, but so if you would like to ask a question, just type it into the chat. You can send it to either me, Nicole Moen, or you can send the chat to everyone so everyone can see it. Either works for me. So I would encourage anyone who has any questions to type those into the chat. Then I will read them out loud. We are recording this, and we'll wait for Professor Clarman to answer. Okay, I see. Great. We got some questions popping up in the chat, so I'll begin. Let's see. Question near the top. Are there any proclivities or trends among the Democrats that you see as concerning for democracy as well? If so, what are they in your view?
Most of the hardball politics that's been played with democracy. So when a party like the Republican Party loses the governorship of North Carolina, Wisconsin, or Michigan, stealing powers from the governor, trying to make it harder to put referenda on the ballot, refusing to acknowledge referenda that have been passed, which Republicans have done in many states with regard to expansions of Medicare, Medicaid, increasing the minimum wage, mandating that legislative districts be drawn by nonpartisan commissions, efforts to restrict the electorate. Democrats have not done any of these things. Gerrymandering has traditionally been done by both sides. Gerrymandering has gotten much worse in recent years, both because of technological change, advanced computers, but also because of increases in information. We now know down to the block level what voting patterns are. Democrats have mostly not done the sort of extreme gerrymandering that Republicans have done. For example, in North Carolina, Republicans, while winning about 50% of the vote in congressional races, did such an extreme gerrymander that they won 10 out of 13 congressional seats. There is no state where Democrats have done anything like that. One big question right now is whether Democrats will fight back, fighting fire with fire. So Republicans are already bragging in states like Florida, Georgia, Texas, that they're going to gerrymander the hell out of congressional districts. They can easily get two new seats in Georgia, 2 new seats in Michigan, probably several seats in Texas, at least a couple in Florida, so that if everything all of the House races today came out the same way they did in 2020, Republicans would gain control just by virtue of more extreme gerrymandering. Now, Democrats control the gerrymandering, the districting process in Illinois and New York, and I think they would be crazy not to gerrymander in response, but Democrats have a significant portion of the party that's committed to good government reform. I'm sorry, just give me 1 second when my turned off my phone. When my phone says something to me, it interferes with my speaking to you. Democrats in Virginia and New Jersey now control the redistricting process. In both states, they've declined to take advantage of the opportunity to gerrymander, and instead they've adopted. That should be the last one because my phone just told me it's disconnected. So they've turned down the opportunity to gerrymander in several states. The biggest state, California, Democrats can't gerrymander because voters adopted an impartial commission. in some states like Michigan, where in Florida, voters adopted a similar sort of reform, but Republicans in the legislature just ignore it, and they're going to go ahead and gerrymander and hope that the Republican-dominated state Supreme Court won't interfere with their violation of the state constitution. Nobody thinks Democrats should come up with ways to interfere with Republican voters, right? What the Republican Party in Georgia did, for example, is they said, we've got to declare war on mail ballots because 2/3 of the mail ballots in 2020 were cast by Democrats. We need to eliminate provisional ballots because 2/3 of the provisional ballots were cast by Democrats. Democrats could do the same thing. They could say, we're going to make it harder for white people over 70 to vote. That would be a real problem for the Republican Party. Now, you're not allowed to say we're making it harder for white people over 70, but you could figure out surrogates for that to make it more difficult for core Republican voters to vote. But Democrats don't do that because it's reprehensible to do that. That's a real problem. The two parties are playing to some extent by a different set of rules. And that's a huge problem. I mean, political scientists talk about that. What do you do when you're in an arms race? If you accelerate the arms race by doing tit for tat, you risk blowing up the world. But if you don't, you're engaging in unilateral disarmament. So that's a real big problem.
Let's see, another question. Could you share your thoughts on President Biden's SCOTUS commission? Sorry, SCOTUS for non-lawyers, Supreme Court of the United States.
I'm going to be really candid. I mean, this is a joke as far as I'm concerned. When the Republicans decided to press forward with Amy Barrett, despite the rank hypocrisy in doing exactly what they had said 4 years earlier should not be done, and with some of them like Lindsey Graham just explicitly repudiating what they had said on television within the previous 6 months about how you should hold them to their statement that they would not support a Republican appointment in the year before an election, then a lot of Democrats started taking up the idea of court expansion, people who never would have dreamed of doing this before. And I would say I never would have dreamed of recommending this 5 years before, but after McConnell stole a Supreme Court seat, I think Democrats need to fight back. The commission is a joke in order to avoid any real reform, but act as if Biden is responding to his progressive base, which thinks that it is political suicide for the Democrats not to do things like admit DC as a state, break the filibuster, and do some sort of court reform to prevent the Supreme Court from striking down democracy entrenchment. Nobody who has advocated court reform is on the commission. There are several conservatives like Judge Thomas Griffiths on the DC Circuit who surely think that nothing needs to be done about Supreme Court reform. They'll take testimony and so forth. I think of myself as a fairly prominent advocate of court reform in the form of expansion. I wrote a big piece in the Atlantic about it a couple months ago. I've thought hard to myself about whether I would serve. I wasn't asked. I knew I wouldn't be asked because I've advocated court reform. Fair enough. I don't think I would testify because I think the whole thing is basically a farce to make it clear that Biden is doing something that his base cares about, but with actually coming up with any actual reform. Now, there are two distinct issues here. One, I think, could actually command bipartisan agreement. Something should be done about the Supreme Court. I don't put forward court expansion as bipartisan. I've said the Republicans stole a seat. Democrats are entitled to it back. Republicans have systematic advantages in the Senate and the presidency. You can't change those things except by amendment. And obviously, you're not going to get an amendment as long as Republicans understand they benefit from those things. But you can control the Supreme Court by statute, and Democrats have the chance, and they need to do that. I don't expect any Republicans to support that. I'm trying to convince Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema that that should be supported. The bipartisan reform would look something like this. So the Supreme Court now has lifetime tenure with justices timing their replacements, meaning if they don't have the bad fortune to die suddenly like Scalia or can't quite make it past the end of a Republican's term like Ginsburg, they time their replacement to ensure that they are replaced by a president who thinks like they do. There's an incentive to appoint very young justices, 42-year-olds like Clarence Thomas, 49-year-olds like Amy Barrett. And there is complete randomness in that someone like Jimmy Carter gets 0 appointments in an entire term in office, while William Howard Taft got 5 or 6. You could solve all, and you could, one more problem, which is justices occasionally serving till they're 90 years old, which can't possibly be a good idea. You wouldn't hire a 90-year-old to fly your airplane, and you wouldn't hire a 90-year-old to be your president. There's no reason why a 90-year-old should be on the Supreme Court. And I don't mean to be ageist, but I'm sorry, at some age, we can't do the same job that we could do previously. You could solve all those problems with 18-year staggered terms. So every president would get 2 appointments in a single term. There would be no randomness. There would be no strategic timing of your retirement. You would have 18 years and then you'd be gone. There would be no strategy advantage in appointing young people, because you could appoint a 65-year-old and they would still probably get 18 years. And you would not have the problem that people are serving longer than they should. That's a brilliant idea that several commentators have proposed, I think beginning with 2 of my students. I'm not taking credit for it. I think they invented the idea 15 years ago in a law review note that I supervised but made no contribution to substantively. Since then, it's become embraced by a wide variety of people. I would think both sides could easily agree to that. And going forward, I would be fine with that. It doesn't solve the current problem, which is the court has been stacked to make it the most conservative court in the last 100 years, according to many academic studies, even though the country is now a center-left country that elects presidents in 7 of the last 8 popular votes who are Democratic, and in which the 50 Democratic senators represent 42 more million people than the 50 Republican senators.
Thank you. Let's see. Do you agree with the position that in addition to xenophobia, the support for undemocratic forces like Trump is due to the failure of the liberal elites and the Democratic establishment to address growing income inequality, the exclusion of the working class from the benefits of globalization, the stalling of social mobility, and the alienation caused due to emphasis?
I absolutely do agree with that, but I need to hedge it a little bit, because otherwise it sounds like a kind of both sidesism, which is just not justified. Right now, think about what Joe Biden is doing. Whether you agree with it or disagree with it, he is doing something truly extraordinary in American politics. He is proposing something like $6 billion of spending, which will disproportionately go to benefit poor people and the middle class and be financed by taxes on wealthy people and corporations. $6 trillion, that is a tremendous amount of money, whether you agree with it or not. This is more money in constant dollars than the New Deal represented. Now, the Republican Party is universally opposing that. Every single Republican in Congress voted against the pandemic relief bill. Every one of them will vote against the infrastructure bill in its current iteration. Every one of them will vote against the family assistance bill. So let's be clear about which political party is interested in doing something to help the working class and which is not. Now, it's true that the neo-Ayn Randism, and I said this in my presentation, the neo-Ayn Randism that became prevalent in the 1980s and 90s seeped into the Democratic Party. You saw it in the Wall Street Treasury secretaries appointed both by Obama and Clinton. You saw it in the move toward deregulation in the Clinton administration that helped create the collapse, the economic collapse in 2008. You saw it in Clinton's willingness to end welfare as we know it. You saw it in lots of ways. However, what's changed in the last 10 or 15 years is that the Democratic Party has started listening to all of these economists, like the French economist Piketty and people at especially at Berkeley, some at Harvard, who've been writing about economic inequality and how it has become vastly greater in the last 40 years. right? We move in cycles. Robert Putnam at Harvard has written an interesting book about this. It's called The Upswing. And he talks about how before the New Deal, we had an era of extreme inequality, the era of the robber barons, the era before government regulation. Then we had a New Deal and World War II and post-decades upswing in which we thought about culturally, politically, economically, socially. We thought about ourselves as being part of a society. We had a political bipartisanship. We had economic initiatives to help the working class, help labor unions, tax wealthy people. And now in the last 40 or 50 years, we are back in the downswing where the emphasis on an I society, right? The culture is very, the opposite of altruistic, very selfish. Politics is riven by partisanship. Economic policy is dominated by efforts to redistribute wealth, but in a regressive rather than progressive direction. I think, and I think Putnam thinks, that we might be at the beginning of a new upswing, partly because of the demographic shifts, partly because younger people tend to be more progressive on a lot of issues. Most of what the Democratic Party is proposing to do economically is extremely popular. 70% supported the pandemic relief bill, more than 60% support both of the infrastructure bill, the family bill, 60 to 70% support increasing the minimum wage. What's happened, and there's a really good political science book on this called Let Them Eat Tweets or something like this by a political scientist at Yale and Berkeley. The key is to seeing the relationship between these things. Somebody like Mitt Romney, who has shown tremendous courage in the last year by taking on Trump, he doesn't understand that his embrace of neo-Ayn Randism is what's led to this ascendance within the Republican Party of racial resentment, religious resentment, and xenophobia. When you embrace neo-Ayn Randian policies that are not supported by large percentages of voters, the only way to win elections is to change the topic and make it about Mexicans taking your jobs, Muslims taking your security, Democrats trying to force your young your young daughters into bisexual transgender bathrooms. Because if you focus on Republican economic policy, like the tax cuts of 2017 or the efforts to repeal Obamacare, those are supported by at most 30 to 35% of the country. So you have to win the white working class, not by appealing to them on economic issues, because they don't support your economic policy. You have to focus on cultural issues. Democrats are taking away your guns. They're taking away your ability to say Merry Christmas. They're giving everything to Black people who don't work hard through affirmative action. That's the strategy. And I'm pretty sure that Lynn Cheney and Mitt Romney, as much as I honor them for what they're doing, which I think is very courageous, they don't understand the role they played in creating the policy, the problem.
Okay. Could you talk a little bit about how the size of the Supreme Court has changed historically?
Yeah, I can tell you that in a nutshell, and this is kind of a funny story. So it's clear from the Constitution that there is no size specified, which means from Article 3, Congress gets to decide. The first Congress in 1789 wrote this 1789 Judiciary Act, which was the basic building blocks of the federal judiciary. Among other things, they created lower federal courts, which the Constitution doesn't require. Article 3 requires a Supreme Court, but it only authorizes at Congress's discretion lower federal courts. So what they did with the Supreme Court was to create a court with 6 justices. Now, the framers were really smart, but that was a pretty dumb thing to do because everybody knows you don't want an evenly divided court. You want an odd number of justices. I think everybody creating a court ever since then has recognized that was a mistake. In 1800, after losing the election, the Federalist Party in the lame duck session provided that the court would shrink to 5 at the next vacancy. Now, you can't abolish a justice, but you could provide at the next vacancy, the court will shrink to 5. Now, they said they were doing that because you didn't need that many justices, you would save money, and an odd number was better. But the real reason was because Jefferson had won the election, and the Federalists, who were losing power, didn't want, they were doing what McConnell did, exactly what McConnell did. They were taking away a seat from the president who they opposed. Obviously, the Jeffersonians, once they were in power, undid that, and they restored the court to 6. Near the end of Jefferson's presidency, the Jeffersonians dominated Congress and they expanded the court to 7. Now, they had a pretty good reason to do that. There were new states coming into the Union. Tennessee, Vermont, Ohio had all been added since the founding. And remember, back then, the justices had to ride circuit. Literally, they spent more than half their time traveling on really bad roads, staying at really bad accommodations, because they had to sit with the district judges on circuit. So if the country was growing, it made sense to expand the court, although it didn't hurt that Jeffersonians were creating another seat for Jefferson to appoint. The Jacksonians did the same thing in 1837 as Jackson left office. They expanded the court from 7 to 9. Again, they had a pretty good reason to do it. There were lots of new states by 1837. It was very difficult. That's just the beginning of establishing railroads, and only in places like densely populated places like New York and Boston. So again, it made some sense. In the 1860s, during Lincoln's presidency, during the Civil War, they expanded the court to 10, partly because they were creating a new Western circuit for California and Oregon, but also because this was a court that was dominated by Democrats, and now Republicans controlled Congress and the presidency. So now you had a 10-person court. Now, Lincoln was assassinated and Andrew Johnson became president. Andrew Johnson wasn't even a Republican, and he immediately was at war with Republicans over Reconstruction policy. So Republicans said, well, we're not going to let you put new people on the court. So they reduced the court at the next vacancies from 10 to 7, so that Johnson couldn't get any appointments. Then when Grant replaced Johnson, they immediately increased it to 9 in 1869, and that's where it stood ever since. FDR planned to increase it in 1937 because the court had struck down several core New Deal provisions, and Roosevelt had won just an enormous landslide. Democrats utterly dominated Congress, and he thought that the court ought to be expanded. Now, he was very disingenuous about this. He packaged it as a judicial reform proposal, saying that the court was too old, that the justices were not getting their work done. That was very disingenuous, and you note I didn't embrace that sort of idea at all. I think you should be explicit about what you're doing. Roosevelt's argument would be, look, the country just handed a landslide victory to Democrats. Through the accidents of retirements and deaths, I got no appointments in my first term. I'm entitled to control the court. But he said instead, for every justice over 70 who declines to retire, I should get another appointment. Now, there were 6 justices over 70, so he was essentially saying the court should expand to 15. Most people thought that was a way to destroy the court. Even many Democrats opposed it. Remember, this is the era of international fascism. Many Republicans accused Roosevelt of wanting to be an authoritarian leader, and packing the court was the sort of thing that the Nazis did in Germany. It's what Huey Long, a wannabe demagogue, had done in Louisiana. So it kind of backfired, and Roosevelt, even though he was incredibly astute as a politician, really played his hand very badly. He kept this secret. He didn't nail down support from key Democratic constituencies. He alienated many supporters by acting as if age was the problem, whereas Louis Brandeis was the oldest justice and he was not the problem from any New Dealer's perspective. And then he refused to compromise. Most historians think Roosevelt could have gotten 2 or 3 new justices, but he couldn't believe, having just won one of the biggest landslides in history, that Congress would dare deny him anything he wanted. So he refused to compromise, and he ended up getting nothing. However, as you probably know, or at least those of you who are lawyers, he won the war even though he lost the battle. In his next 2 terms, he appointed 7 or 8 new justices through death and resignation. So he ended up recreating the court almost entirely. by the time he died in 1945.
On that, do you think there's an upper limit for the Supreme Court if you were implementing court reforms? Is there an upper limit for the non-lawyers? Many of these circuit courts of appeal have substantially more than 9 judges in them, and yet they manage to function and often hear cases and matters en banc, which means with all of them, and sometimes there are over 20. Professor Klarman, do you have a position or a recommendation as to what an optimal size or range for the Supreme Court would be?
I don't, and your point is exactly right. When circuit courts sit en banc, they're more than 9. However, the Ninth Circuit decided that it had become unwieldy, right? The Ninth Circuit was so big, I don't remember if it was 25 or 30 judges, and they just decided that was unwieldy, so they broke their en bancs into panels. I'm sure that the number is, somewhere between 5 and 15 probably, but we would just want a political scientist who studied different courts, and probably there's no ideal number, but you get too big, it becomes unwieldy, and too small, it's not representative enough. My key point is not that it needs a certain number, but that Democrats are entitled to control right now, mostly because of this systematic political disadvantaging that is going to be a huge problem. So I just want to make this clear to everybody. Demographers predict that by 2040, which is really just around the corner, in 20 years, 70% of Americans will live in 15 states. That means 70% will elect 30% of the Senate. Now, the political geography, the partisan geography of the nation can change. It's not written in stone that people in Wyoming will always be Republican. They weren't in the 1960s, for example. But if that partisan geography holds, you're going to have 30% of the country electing 70% of the Senate. And that's a formula for revolution at some point. It's just not the case that Americans are going to take that lying down. Suppose that Democrats win the Electoral College vote, not by 4.5%, by 6 or 7%. Is that going to be a legitimate government? People criticize the idea of court expansion by saying you're going to delegitimize the Supreme Court. I'm worried about us no longer having a democratic government with a Republican Party inclined to suppress votes at every turn, willing to embrace violence, trying to re-explain what happened on January 6th, trying to re-educate the country about whether the President of the United States incited a coup. I'm worried about democracy being delegitimized. If part of the way to solve that is to delegitimize the Supreme Court, frankly, I can live with that. I understand why people who benefit from the status quo are happy to rest on their laurels, but at some point, you're going to have a revolution if you think you can prevent a rising generation from exerting its fair share of political power. I just don't think that's sustainable for long.
Professor Klarman, you noted a pattern of authoritarianism coming to power in a number of Western countries in the last decade or two. Can you identify any global or even just Western social or economic changes that might have driven these political changes? Yeah,
that's a great question. There's good scholarship on this for people who are interested. How Democracies Die, written by 2 Harvard political scientists, Ziblatt and Levitsky, is terrific on this. Larry Diamond at Stanford, who's one of the foremost comparative scholars of democracy, has written something, it's something called Ill Winds or something like that. They're talking about why democracy is being subverted around the world. Freedom House, which is a nonprofit that rates democracies, has significantly downgraded several countries. India just went in the last year from being free to being partly free. Hungary and Poland are no longer rated very highly as democracies. And they've downgraded the United States, which I'm sure still is regarded as wholly free. But on a scale of 100, the United States has fallen by at least 10 points in the last 15 years. The main explanations, I think, have to do with kind of what you would predict. One is the whole world is experiencing the economic tumult of globalization and technological change, which has made the lives of working class citizens more difficult. The United States is more extreme, and the United States doesn't provide the same sort of social safety net. So if you're in France and you're put out of work by the pandemic, you're going to be taken care of in a way that the United States doesn't always take care of you. So part of this is economic changes, which were accelerated with the collapse of 2008. A lot of it is migration. So the mass migration to Europe, mostly Germany in 2015, is what played into the hands of wannabe demagogues in Hungary and Poland, even though ironically those countries took very few immigrants. But obviously this had a big effect in Germany, where the right-wing quasi-fascist Alternative for Germany has won 13% of the vote. The National Front in France with Marine Le Pen, has a decent chance to win the presidency in the next presidential election. So some combination of economic turmoil and immigration threatening, Europe doesn't look at itself as a country of immigrants. It doesn't celebrate diversity like many in the United States do. So the idea that you could have, African and Asian non-Christians come into countries like Poland and Hungary with very strong white Catholic traditions and overwhelmingly white Catholic populations, that's very disturbing. Now, the United States has those things too, but the United States also has aspects of its political system which make it easier for both an authoritarian to gain control and for a minority political party to hang on to power. So other countries don't necessarily have gerrymandering. Other countries have proportional representation, which makes it very difficult for extremists to gain control of the government. Other countries don't have partisan primaries like the United States, which enabled somebody who's on the extreme like Donald Trump to win a party nomination. And then because of extraordinary political polarization, essentially all Republicans voted for Trump, even though 50 years ago, 25% of Republicans wouldn't vote for Barry Goldwater. We're now way past the era in which voters will sometimes cross party lines. You add that together, we have partisan districting commissions. Most countries that are sensible don't allow politicians to draw district lines. We have much more money in politics, which contributes to extremism. You add all that up, and it provides a formula for wannabe demagogues to try to take control. I think the United States is more capable of fighting that. So we have a much more entrenched system of democracy than Poland and Hungary have. They were communist authoritarian regimes for much of the last 100 years. They are budding democracies which have lost their democratic consolidation in the last 15 years. The United States can fight back because we have a strong tradition. And part of what happened in the first 2 years of the Trump administration is that the system did fight back. Jeff Sessions recused himself. Rod Rosenstein appointed a special counsel. The Republican Party made it clear to Trump he could not fire that special counsel. Lots of bureaucrats in the government fought back against Trump's efforts to exert pressure on them. But what was really stunning to many experts, including Levitsky and Ziblatt, is how quickly the Republican Party folded in the second half of the Trump administration. So, what Trump did in Ukraine would have been impeachable for any president in American history, and one Republican in the Senate voted to remove him from office. Trump incited a violent coup against the nation on January 6th, and fewer than 10% of Republicans in the House and the Senate voted to disqualify him from office again, right? The Republican Party has basically embraced, well, it's the voters in the Republican Party. 70% of them believe that Trump won the election. A significant percentage of them believe that Barack Obama, even to this day, was not born in the United States. 30% of them think there's a lot of good to be found in QAnon conspiracy. The party is rationally responding to what its voters are willing to support, which is we are entitled to rule regardless of whether we can win votes. So if that means violence, we'll take it. If that means stealing elections, we'll take it. We are eliminating everybody who is unwilling to line up behind Trump in claiming the election was stolen. We will defeat Brad Raffensperger, so there's no longer a Georgia Secretary of State who will stand up for a fair election. We've already removed from office the Michigan State Election Commission official who refused to say the election was stolen. We are setting ourselves up for civil war in 2024. I hope that won't happen, and it's hard to imagine how we could literally have a civil war. It is easy to imagine how the 2024 election turns into the disaster scenario that we actually narrowly avoided in 2020. We were a lot closer to the disaster scenario than most people appreciate. It turns out that a bunch of Republicans in various state legislatures and in executive positions were not on board with stealing an election. They were taken aback at the idea that you could so loosely charge election fraud and try to steal the election. But things are being set up so that none of those people will be in office in 4 years.
I know we're running a little bit over, but I think you have a little bit more time. So I'm going to ask two questions I think are potentially related. So one is, do you see the current Democratic versus Republican disunion leading to the rise of a third party? And then also, absent the Republican blocking mechanisms that have been described, would the country become a one-party system, which could be much more damaging in the long term?
Political scientists have come up with a kind of theorem. It has a name and I can't remember it. If you have a political system like ours, meaning we vote in districted constituencies, and in order to win, all you have to do is be the first past the post. You don't have to win a majority. That system almost inevitably produces a two-party system. If you wanted to move toward proportional representation or third parties, you would have to come up with a different system. Most of the world that we identify as being like us, Australia, New Zealand, Western Europe, Canada, most countries moved toward proportional representation in the early 20th century. The United States did not. And that's actually an interesting story in itself. I'm not an expert on this, but I read a pretty good book that talks about this. If you have proportional representation, there are advantages and disadvantages, but one big advantage is it's hard for an extremist to become the autocrat. Donald Trump, by winning 35 or 40% of the vote in Republican primaries, won the Republican nomination, and then by winning 46% of the popular vote, won the presidency. That wouldn't really be possible if you were in a system with multiple parties and without partisan primaries. If you had party elites choosing their candidate, which we had for most of our history, Trump would have been impossible, certainly before the reforms of 1972, and probably impossible until the 1990s. You're just not going to get an extremist autocrat, somebody like Huey Long, George Wallace, Henry Ford, people who at various times seemed to aspire to a kind of autocratic control, never would have been nominated by major political parties. So, there are advantages to multi-party systems, but the only way to get there would be some sort of reform, like some jurisdictions are moving to ranked choice voting. Ranked choice voting, which is now the rule in Maine, was a response to a crazy Republican winning the governorship. He brags that he was Trump before Trump. He won the governorship, winning about 35 to 40% of the vote. But Maine is a system where Democrats and independents also poll about 30% of the vote. So this guy, what's his name? Sorry, I've forgotten his name. He became governor of Maine without winning 40% of the vote, and he was, as extreme as Trump. So, if you want to move in a different direction, you need ranked choice voting. Think about Lisa Murkowski. Lisa Murkowski is probably the most moderate Republican in the Senate. She voted for impeachment. She voted against confirming, I think she voted against Kavanaugh. She voted against repealing Obamacare. Why is she able to do that? Well, part of the reason is because she already knows in Alaska she can win without being the Republican nominee because she's done it. She was a successful write-in candidate. but Alaska just moved to a top 4 system and a nonpartisan primary. So the top 4 candidates entered into the primary get to go to the general election, meaning she doesn't have to be nominated by the Republican Party. She could care less whether she's nominated by the Republican Party. She will certainly be one of the top 4 candidates, and therefore she has an incentive for moderation. Compare that to the rest of the Republican caucus, where, you know, even Republicans who, if they had their druthers, would probably break with Trump. Today, they're scared to do it because they're never going to win a primary, right? None of the Republicans who broke with Trump will be renominated. They're all going to lose in primary elections. That's primaries produce that sort of extremism, and geographic districts with first past the post produce a 2-party system and extremism. Was there another part to that I'm missing? The third 1-party system? I don't think we're going to. The way you get a 1-party system is that you have autocratic rules. So you have China and the communist system. I think if you really enfranchise the whole country and you made it easy to vote, Democrats' margin of victory at the national level would move from a presumptive 3 or 5 points to a 10 to 15 point margin, which would then force the Republican Party very quickly to adjust in the other direction. We've had lots of times in our history when one party was that dominant. Beginning in 1860, Republicans won every presidential election until 1884. Beginning in 1932, Democrats won every presidential election until 1952, when the Republicans ran a war hero who wasn't ideological at all. And beginning in 1968, Republicans won by landslide most presidential elections until 1992, with the exception of 1976, which was a Watergate election, which Democrats barely won. So it's not unusual for one political party for a period of time to become dominant, and then either it rests on its laurels or the other party adjusts and moves back to the center. We're never going to have a one-party system unless we have an autocrat managing to dominate, which can happen with minority control. But I don't think that can happen either, because, you know, the United States is not going to, you know, we're never going to be communist China, you know, notwithstanding the sort of steps that the Republican Party has taken. You know, they can't, look what they did in Georgia. They can't massively disfranchise Black people like happened under Jim Crow, when Southern Democrats just disfranchised Black people across the board. All they can do is tinker at the margins. We're going to make it harder for Blacks in Atlanta to vote. You're not going to allow them to get food and water handed out to them. You're going to be harder to get an absentee ballot. It's going to be harder to, you know, deposit your absentee ballot in a drop box. Those are tinkering at the margins. It's not a very attractive thing to do. I think it's reprehensible, but it may not be successful. As many people have pointed out, it's not at all obvious that what the Republicans are doing in Georgia will prevent Stacey Abrams from becoming governor in 2022, right? There's still too much commitment to democracy in the United States to undermine it overnight. You know, I'm scared at some of the things that Trump would do if he had control, and the Republican Party seems willing to accommodate that. But the United States is not going to degrade its democracy overnight. And the demographic forces are so powerful that I think the most you can do is resist them for another election cycle or two. Right? The country is going to be majority minority, which is going to make it really difficult to build a successful party on racial resentment. The country is going to be majority non-Christian, and young people vote by a margin of 30 percentage points for Democrats today. And there's not a lot of evidence that they're going to get more conservative over time. So the demographics seem almost inexorably pushing the country in a certain direction, which the Republican Party has chosen to fight against, right? There was a debate in 2012. There was an autopsy. What should we do? And the conclusion was we should appeal to Latinos. Trump then emerged and say, hey, you don't need to appeal to Latinos. You can say that they're trying to come into the country to rape and murder us, and you'll win enough white people that you don't need to win Latinos. And then somehow miraculously won more of the Latinos 4 years later, although not a lot more. That's been exaggerated. He's still only winning about a third of the Latino vote. So I'm pretty confident in the long term. What I'm not confident about, and I'm actually desperately concerned about, is the next 4 to 8 years when I don't know what's going to happen. And I think it could be quite dangerous.
All right, well, with that, I know we've kept you past our time, and Professor Klarman, thank you so much for joining us today and presenting your talk. Thank you so much for staying long and answering all the questions. We did not get to all of them, but I want to be mindful of the time, and we really, really appreciate this robust and vigorous discussion. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed it. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. All right, and that concludes our Zoom meeting. I hope everyone enjoyed it. Thank you so much for joining us. And for those of you who are in Minnesota, I look forward to seeing you at future Harvard Club of Minnesota events. Have a good night, everyone.